Hello, everyone. Good evening to members of the audience who are here in Singapore or elsewhere in an East Asian time zone. Good morning to members of the audience who are coming in from the United States or US Eastern Time. And thank you for signing up for this webinar. Today's discussion is being co-hosted by the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore and by the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. My name is Richard Yarrow, and I'm a fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Business and Government, and a visiting fellow here in Singapore at the East Asian Institute. In recent months, Eastern Europe has received global attention thanks to the war in Ukraine, conjuring memories of 20th century tensions that linger and, to some extent, still trouble the region. However, it would be a mistake to view Eastern Europe over the last 30 years through the prism of the recent war. In fact, since 1989, parts of Eastern Europe have witnessed some of the world's fastest sustained economic development. In the 1980s, Poland had a lower per capita GDP than Suriname did, and the region's economic failures and many problems helped inspire Janos Kornai's theories of the soft budget constraint. Today, Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, and many other Eastern European states belong to the community of wealthy nations, as well as the European Union, and a handful of Eastern European EU members boast a combined GDP larger than that of Russia. Looking back, we can ask, how did this transformation take place? What challenges did Eastern European countries encounter as they approached economic reforms? As countries in East Asia struggle to reform highly centralized or state-dominated economic systems, what can countries in East Asia learn from the varied successes and challenges in Eastern Europe? To tackle these vital topics, I'm very pleased and honored to introduce three exceptional scholars of Eastern Europe and East Asia. Lajos Bokros, our first speaker, is a professor of public policy and economics at the Central European University in Vienna. In the early 1990s, he served as Minister of Finance of Hungary, where he was vital to reforms in Hungary's economy. Marcin Piatkowski, our second speaker, is a professor of economics at Kozminski University. He's the author of the recently published book, Europe's Growth Champion, analyzing Poland's post-1989 economic reform trajectory. He has studied and written about economies in Eastern Europe as well as in Vietnam and China. Dwight Perkins, our final speaker, is Professor Emeritus of Economics at Harvard University, where he served as chairman of the Harvard Economics Department. Perkins is the former director of Harvard's Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, Harvard's Asia Center, and the Harvard Institute for International Development. We will begin tonight's discussion with their presentations, followed by a moderated question and answer session. Members of the audience may use the Q&A feature on Zoom at the bottom of your screens to ask questions at any time, and we will begin to answer those questions and go through those questions with the panelists after the presentations. And with that, I am delighted to invite Lajos to begin with his remarks.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's a great pleasure and privilege for me to address this highly prestigious gathering today. I must confess in advance that I'm not an expert on East Asia, not an expert on China, but I consider myself relatively good expert on Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. As the director of the World Bank between 1996 and 2004, I had the pleasure to work in each and every Central and Eastern European country and former member states of the Soviet Union, except for Belarus and Turkmenistan. So I visited all of them, some of them 100 times. I spent more than 1 year in Moscow on a net basis, and that gave me an extraordinary opportunity to look at the problems of transition, not only from theoretical perspective, but also in practice on the ground. So if you allow me, I will use my limited time to sketch the political economy of transition, how I see it. And just for your benefit, I show here my book, which I wrote about it, about transition, and was published by Central European University 9 years ago. Let's start with the political economy part. What we can consider the most important characteristics of what we used to call command economy and command society, because it's not only about the economy, but more broadly about society. This society had usually very, very strong vertical societal dependencies, bonds, very hierarchical societal architecture. From economic point of view, one of the most important characteristic feature was that the Communist Party never acknowledged the autonomy of the consumer. So we did not have consumer autonomy. The Communist Party pretended to know better than individuals or groups of people what would have been relatively wealthy and good for consumers. As a consequence, we did not have enterprises. These were just units of production which followed, instead of market signals, commands coming from the central planning agency. As a consequence, there was no supply side adjustment in the system, which led to tremendous amount of shortage and waste. Last but not least, it is important to mention that the Soviet communist system was a closed economy and a closed society, although it had some foreign trade and some very well orchestrated, organized, and supervised travel on the margin. That was never a God-given right for the citizens. So it was a totalitarian system with a very strong party state. I will skip this slide because it would be very superficial now within this short time frame to look at the different models which existed within what I call Soviet communism. If there are questions, of course, I can come back to that. I know that Richard will ask about the financial sector. As a consequence, I highlight the line which is about the banking system, one before the last one, which says that in the classical Stalinist and the Hungarian model, we used to have a one-tier banking system, and that's important compared to the normal two-tier banking systems, what we know from capitalist market economies. In my book, I presented what I called the matrix of structural reforms in transition. Again, something I can elaborate on later. Let me just restrict my comments by saying that this is not an exhaustive matrix. There are many other reforms, but these reforms which are highlighted here can be considered as absolutely indispensable for creating a well-functioning capitalist market economy. So if any of the elements are missing, then the transition cannot be considered as being over. And in many countries, these reforms constituted what I will later mention as a critical mass of reforms, without which there is no successful transition. So let me just summarize the lessons learned from reforms, the structural reforms in Eastern and Central Europe. One important lesson is that reforms are always reversible. There is no such thing in societal development that once you have reached a certain stage, the only way to go is further up and implement even more. Transition as a consequence is never inevitable, and of course the success is far from guaranteed. Individual reforms are of course necessary, but by themselves never sufficient. As I mentioned, what we need is a critical mass of the structural reforms. I remember 30 years ago, there was a tremendous fruitless discussion in Central and Eastern Europe about the speed of reforms. For me, that was never the essence of the issue. Consistency, from my perspective, is much more important, because if reforms are botched, then it can easily destroy efficiency. One important area which I can highlight in this respect is privatization. In many countries, the so-called mass privatization schemes were considered as a kind of panacea or a Wunderwaffe to solve the problems of transforming a command economy into a market-orientated one. But that proved to be largely a failure. So the slower paced traditional methods applicable to privatization proved much more important when it came to the essence of transition, which is to transform enterprises, attract new capital, and change corporate governance. We should never forget that all reforms are political. So we are talking not only about policy, but politics at the same time. And it meant that in these countries, what we needed was sustained political support, which was not always there. And as a consequence, reforms stalled or even reversed. I mentioned the name of Professor Leszek Balcerowicz, who is a good friend of mine, who was talking about the time of extraordinary politics when these reforms started. And he meant by that the fact that at the very beginning, societies wanted to get rid of communism to such a great extent that they accepted the price and costs of reforms. But it was a kind of a honeymoon period, so it could not last too long unless the first fruits of these reforms provided tangible results for society. What I think about China, where is China on the road of transition? Let me highlight very, very briefly. China cannot be considered as a command economy anymore. So this is absolutely dissimilar to what we used to have under the Soviet system. And the most important reason for that is that the private sector in China is huge. And more importantly, it is embedded in the world market economy. So China, for all intents and purposes, at least to a very large extent, an open economy. Of course, it is a different type of capitalist market economy with a huge oversized state sector still. And again, more importantly, a heavy-handed state intervention, even into the private sector. So the Communist Party is an unconstrained actor, and it can change the rules of the game for millions of private entrepreneurs at will. Now, the question of historic importance for me is whether the state sector will diminish further significantly, or it will remain close to half of the economy as it is today? That's a great question and a huge challenge for the Communist Party, because the state-owned enterprises are inefficient or much less efficient than most of the private ones. And one important reason, not the only one, but one of the important reasons is that state-owned enterprises have a political objective, a political mandate to provide employment. And as a consequence, they are overburdened with overemployment. That is, on the other hand, a keystone of political stability, as policymakers would say in China. Another important issue is that there is no generally applicable, uniformly enforced and transparent rule for bankruptcy and liquidation. I teach in all universities, wherever I go, that bankruptcy and liquidation is not a bad thing, but a good thing. This shows the viability and efficiency of capitalism. And socialists try to project always the superiority of their system by saying that enterprises do not go bankrupt. This is a bad thing, because that means that capital can remain locked in inefficient ventures. And that is what is happening in China. It's not the market, but the Communist Party which decides which enterprise would go out of business. So entry and exit, the liberalization of entry and exit, is an absolutely necessary, albeit insufficient, prerequisite for a well-functioning capitalist market economy. In addition, in China, we see individualized taxation, which seriously distorts competition. Not only taxation, but also subsidization, which can be considered as negative taxation, which leads to a hybrid system whereby winners and losers are not selected by the market, but by the state. And that is in itself a huge problem when it comes to inefficiency. From my perspective, the Achilles heel of the Chinese economy is the financial sector. And the problem is not only that the 5 large state-owned banks are so dominant that they set the rules of the game in the whole financial sector, but the problem is more that these banks, in addition to several types of private banks, behave like policy banks. Formally, in each and every country, even in the US and in very liberal market economies, one can see the existence of a development bank and export promotion agency or bank. Those are the ones which we usually consider policy banks. But in China, all the banks are policy banks. They follow the directives of the Communist Party, and in many cases they keep lending to inefficient ones, especially state-owned enterprises, because that is what underpins the policy of the Communist Party to keep political stability. As a consequence, the banks keep accumulating huge amounts of non-performing loans, which in turn leads to their recurrent recapitalization by the state. Fortunately, the Chinese state has enough of precious funds, especially foreign exchange, to recapitalize the banks. But the banks are all technically bankrupt, in my humble view, because they have negative capital and they kept artificially viable by this almost permanent recapitalization. They also benefit from what we call financial repression. It happens not only in China, but in many other places. But in China, it is especially acute in the sense that the central bank would not only regulate the money supply and influence interest rates, but sometimes set interest rates and order individual commercial banks to keep lending to non-viable enterprises. In recent days, we saw that in case of the real estate sector, where basically bankrupt developer companies were kept alive artificially by huge subsidies from the central bank. China is fortunate that it has very high propensity to save, and as a consequence, the banks are flooded by private savings. And since financial repression is also expressed in the sense that people have very limited choice of investment alternatives, the currency is not fully convertible. They have to ask for permissions if they want to send their money abroad, usually. And on the one hand, the Chinese Communist Party wants the renminbi yuan to become a world market reserve currency. But on the other hand, it is afraid of capital flight as a consequence of people suffering from this financial repression. If there are questions, I can talk about the problems of Hungary, which is now expressing itself in the fact that it is getting closer to China in terms of this directed capitalist semi-market economy. But I will skip that just to conclude that, in my humble view, the most important bottleneck for the completion of successful transition is China is the lack of the rule of law. The rule of law is not only a political fig leaf, which we need to have if we feel that this is important for liberal democracy. No. The rule of law is absolutely and directly important and indispensable for economic development. Why? Several reasons. One thing which stands out is that private property should be protected, and it should be protected against unconstrained government intervention. That's not the case in China. And the situation is very fast deteriorating in Hong Kong as well. In a normal rule of law environment, the state is there to enhance competition rather than distort competition. The state is there to regulate and destroy monopolies rather than build monopolies. Again, for me, clear and uniformly enforced rule for bankruptcy and liquidation are absolutely critical. Whenever I don't see that in a country, I immediately declare that it is far from completing successful transition. The same holds true for taxation. And last but not least, we need, for strictly speaking economic purposes, an independent and incorruptible judiciary, which again is lacking in China and unfortunately is being destroyed in Hong Kong as well. So I eagerly wait for the comments of those who understand China much better than myself, but this is probably enough from me. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Lajos, for your tremendous presentation and very insightful remarks. We'll now turn to Marcin to give the second presentation.
Yes, good evening, everyone in Singapore, good afternoon in Europe, and good morning in DC from where I'm speaking right now. I hope the slides are visible. Thank you again for inviting me. A great pleasure, privilege, and honor to be here and talk about the lessons learned from the Central and Eastern European transition. I think all of us from the region prefer to call it Central and Eastern Europe rather than Eastern Europe. So I'll stick to that, to this too. What I want to do with you today is share 4 key messages. First, because it's really not entirely well known in East Asia. And I know this because I have worked on China for now 5 years as part of a global development bank. And I have also worked on Vietnam and the Philippines and a few other countries in the regions. And the economic history of the last 30 years of Central and Eastern Europe and its economic success is really not too well known. So I want to show some pieces of evidence to show this tremendous economic change. Then I also want to explain why we have not heard about Central and Eastern Europe before. And the major reason is that the region has been economically backward and underdeveloped for pretty much all of its history. And I'll try to explain based on my book why it has been the case. Then I want to segue into the drivers of CEE's success in the last 33 years after the 1989 transition. Plus a few challenges and a few ideas for what the region needs to do going forward. And both the challenges and solutions very much apply to some parts of Asia. And finally, I will conclude with a few lessons learned, top 5 lessons that I think countries in the region, as different as they are, because China, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, and all others are significantly different from each other. But I think there are some lessons that could be truly useful. So first, I will focus on Poland, a country that I know best, but I think it's a proxy for the whole region. But one big point here to make is, and the reason I wrote the book on Polish economic success over the past 30 years, after 1,000 years of economic underdevelopment, is that this country, but also the rest of the region, has really done extremely well over the past 33 years. Countries like Poland have almost tripled their GDP per capita in real terms and more than tripled in PPP terms. The Baltic states, Slovenia, Czechia, even Hungary has almost doubled its level of capita over that period, and that compares to only about a 40% growth in GDP per capita in Germany. So clearly, there has been a huge change and overall a big economic catching up that has taken in this part of the world. What is also important is that Poland, but also a number of other countries in the region, like particularly Romania, have done also well relatively to its global peers. So I put China here as obviously the biggest economic success story of the last 40 years, but it started from a low, very low income level. So among its global peers, that is upper middle income and high income countries, Poland and Romania have done actually better than a lot of Asian tigers, such as Korea, Singapore, or Malaysia. So I think this in itself is very interesting because I think it's not well known in the region that there is another part of the world that has been quite underdeveloped just a few decades back. And suddenly, all of these countries in Central and Eastern Europe have become high income. The other way to look at this is to look at relative income compared to Germany. So for instance, Poland has gone from about 30% of German level of income at the beginning of transition to almost 2/3 now. The Czech Republic has also improved to 75%. That compares to China, which obviously had a huge improvement, but at the same time, it's still way behind most countries in the region. And also put Russia here, the yellow line, which is an interesting case of a country whose level of income relative to Germany, PPP, has actually gone down. And because of its invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions that have followed, it seems that this gap in incomes will continue to grow. But also in a historical perspective, some of the things I talk about in the book, and here I have a chart for Poland and for China. But again, Poland, I think it's a good proxy for most countries in Central and Eastern Europe, including Hungary. The message from that chart is that for most of the history of the region, all the countries have been behind Western Europe in terms of its level of income. Here I compare it to the United Kingdom, and was after long centuries of relative economic decline, particularly after 16th century, it was only in the last 30 years that the region has started to truly catch up, and it did catch up with the West. I would argue, and there's other sorts of historical data, that virtually every single country in the region is now enjoying its golden age, defined as the smallest gap in the level of income and quality of life relative to the West. It's pretty much its entire history. What is also important, particularly in the context of East Asia, where people work really, really hard, and I think it's true in Vietnam, it's true in China, in Korea, and in Singapore, is that Central and Eastern Europe has also managed to translate its economic success into increased well-being. And you can have different type of rankings that reflect the well-being, but I'm just using this one from the OECD. This is a Better Life Index, and the sort of key message from the chart here is that virtually a large part of countries in Central and Eastern Europe enjoy a higher level of well-being than Korea, even though Korea is actually richer than all countries from the region. So Slovenia, Estonia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Lithuania, they are all countries whose people have apparently, at least according to this ranking, higher quality of life than Korea. What were the sources of underdevelopment? I want to be brief here. This is a picture of a Polish village somewhere in the East in the 1930s, where I'm trying in the book, and I won't elaborate, but in the book, I'm trying to explain why the whole region has been underdeveloped for so long. And my bottom line here is that the region has been virtually a par excellence example of having created extractive political and economic institutions as defined by Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, where a very narrow elites, aristocracy and gentry, has been able to fully monopolize the commanding heights of their economies and political systems. And this monopoly has translated into creating extractive political institutions and extractive economic institutions that has not allowed these countries to grow. And it, as I document in my book, it was reflected in one of the lowest literacy rates in the region. The elite simply did not want to allow the rest of the society to get educated, in the lowest urbanization rates, in the lowest state tax revenue, and the like. So this led me to sort of extend and modify Acemoglu's Robinson model to actually argue that, unfortunately, you need violence and shocks to move from what you would call an extractive society to inclusive society. And pretty much all the countries that have made that transition and have become high income over the past 70 or 100 years, and this is a typology here in the table, virtually all of these countries have gone through a period of violence that was needed to reduce or eliminate the power of the old oligarchic feudal elites. The question then would be, what was the shock that affected Central and Eastern Europe? And here the bad news is that we had two types of bad shocks. One was the Second World War, and this is a picture of Warsaw in 1945. And the other big shock was communism that was imposed on the region in 1945. And communism ended badly, and rightly so. It was a cruel system that was also economically inefficient. And Poland, for instance, was bankrupt in 1989 at the beginning of transition. But I think one thing we all seem to have missed, there was also a system that bulldozed, eliminated the old feudal oligarchic structures that have actually undermined development of the region. And you could not see the sort of benefits of this change under the planned economy until 1989. And Professor Bokros mentioned some of these challenges from the past. But when the transition started, all countries in principle in the region had open, inclusive societies where in principle everyone had a chance of succeeding. Now, let me segue quickly into the drivers of post-89 success that is mostly based on Poland, but a lot of these drivers also apply to other countries in the region, and I think Professor Bokros and others can comment later of what would be different. There were two types of drivers: the proximate drivers, the ones that the IMF and the World Bank and others write about, which is the very direct drivers of reform that have happened just after the beginning of the transition in '89. Some of these were reforms under communism, and particularly Hungary and Poland were one of the lead reformers, which have, for instance, opened up their economies and liberalized prices to a much larger extent than anywhere else in the region. Then there was this period of extraordinary politics the term that Balcerowicz coined, and the deep economic reforms that have followed. There's a whole list that I could elaborate on, and perhaps there will be some time to talk about it in a Q&A. But one thing I want to emphasize, and I think Professor Bokros rightly mentioned it, that at least for Poland, the big difference relative to, say, Ukraine, Russia, and even the Czech Republic and Slovak Republic was the fact that privatization was delayed, which I think is one of the reasons why Poland virtually has no oligarchs today, and one of the reasons why our soccer clubs or football clubs are so bad, because simply there are no billionaires, no oligarchs around to fund these football clubs. And the reason is that mass privatization never happened in Poland and was delayed until 1995, mostly because of the strong opposition of Solidarność, the trade union, and the civil society. And when the narrow-focused mass privatization happened in 1995, the market already existed for assets, so people already knew what kind of prices these assets had to garner in the market. So unlike mass privatization, which was based on the ideology that it's better to sell at any price, even at the price of $1, so that the communists do not come back, I think this has ricocheted against the development of a lot of countries in the region, but not for Poland and a few others. And I think Hungary was a similar case. But I think a big question in economic development for all of us economists is really about not only the reforms, because a lot of times we know what to do. What really matters is the fundamental forces and the political context that may allow or not for good economic policies to take place. So here I talk about the ultimate drivers of growth, the reasons why Polish, Hungarian, Czech, and other elites to various extents have actually wanted to adopt good policies. And I think one of them, somewhat controversially and paradoxically, was the positive legacy of communism, the fact that it left behind an open, broad-based, inclusive society where, in principle, people could really get educated and have a chance of success, more or less regardless of where they were born, what type of whose were the parents, and what kind of connections they had. And obviously, among the other parts, one big, probably a fundamental force for Central and Eastern European success was the prospect and then the EU membership. I think it was absolutely critical because it provided the reform anchor that was needed for all the countries not to stray away from reforms and build all the institutions, including the rule of law, as much as we can now discuss the various differences of what's happening in the region. But without the EU, without the institutions and the rules of the game that were more or less absorbed by the region in the run-up to the EU accession, I don't think this miracle of Central and Eastern Europe would have ever happened. And EU funds, as important as they were, they represented about 0.5 percentage points of growth in Poland, for instance, after the accession in 2004. But I think long-term, the institutions, the sort of the civilization that the region has absorbed over the very short time are really have created a critical foundation for growth. Now, what are the key challenges and solutions for the region to grow forward? And I put this slide here because these solutions are almost universal. They apply not only to Central CEE, but also apply to many countries in East Asia. We all are faced with broad-based global productivity slowdown, and we could have a separate Zoom conference to discuss it. We all face with population aging. Countries like Poland and Hungary are aging at one of the fastest rates in the world, only comparable to, say, China. Climate change is a big issue, particularly for countries that are whose energy systems are based on coal, and this is clearly Poland. There's internal politics, and Hungary and Poland are clearly different from other countries in the region, and also global politics that make the situation, particularly given the war in Ukraine, much more complex. And finally, plutocracy, which is really about growing inequality, which has been a trend in East Asia, but also in Central and Eastern Europe. Some of the solutions, I call them 5 I's, and happy to elaborate on each of them in the Q&A sessions. I think all of the region needs to focus on institutions and strengthen them so that they become as close to their Western blueprints as possible. I think the region underinvests, particularly on the public investment side. The public investment represents about less than 1/3 in proportion to GDP than what it is in China. And we all know that in China, the public investment has gone into diminishing returns and sometimes is negative. But I think Central and Eastern Europe is on the other side on the continuum. It's still underinvest, and there is no reason for this to be happening. And immigration and inclusiveness understood as making sure that inequality stays low or does not increase as it has happened over the past quarter of a century. So finally, that's my concluding slides. What are some of the sort of broad picture lessons for countries in the region? And again, they're all different. China is much different from Vietnam. Vietnam is different from the Philippines, and the Philippines are different from Indonesia. But I think the region cannot recreate the European Union. So in that sense, there's a limit to what one can learn from the CEE experience. But then you can try to imitate the European Union in terms of building institutions that I think we all agree are critical to underpin long-term development. Professor Bokros mentioned some of these institutions, but I think the rule of law, independent central banks, open markets, and the others, which are clearly the ones that I think long-term will be critical for the region to grow. Second, and I think that's obviously a challenge for East Asia, to keep the economies open and markets open, to ensure that there is a level playing field particularly relative to SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and that all these economies are as open as they can be, which is the case in Central and Eastern Europe, because there are no borders between Poland, Germany, and Spain. You can sell your product and put it on a truck. You can produce it in Warsaw, put it on a truck, and sell it in Madrid. And there is no single border on the way that would prevent you from doing it. That's clearly not the case in East Asia. Third, reduce public ownership, another big topic. And there are various ways of how countries should go about it. But clearly, one bottom line from the transition is don't do it in haste. It will only end up in producing oligarchs and oligarchic elites that will undermine development and can actually stop development. So I think a very gradual and cautious approach is called for. Invest in a broad-based society that is mostly about investing in education. A lot of countries in East Asia invest less than what would be required for the long-term development. And also inequality very often is much higher, including in China, where inequality is actually higher than in the United States, which many people find paradoxical and ironic. So I think it's critical to actually make sure that the societies become and remain inclusive. And finally, I think it's important to have some fun every some time, not only to work, and the Koreans, the Chinese, and others are the world leaders in the number of work hours they're put in. But I think it's also important to think about how to translate this into higher quality of life, because ultimately economic development is only a means to an end, which is higher level of happiness and well-being for the society as a whole. So let me stop here and happy to join the Q&A. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Marcin, for the excellent presentation. We have a growing number of very weighty and important topics for the discussion and Q&A. And I will try to remember to refer to Central and Eastern Europe, as you suggest, very rightly. Let's see, I think we still have the PowerPoint up. Is that right? Could you maybe exit the screen share? Excellent.
Good.
I am now delighted to welcome our final speaker, Dwight Perkins, who will move the conversation a little closer to themes in East and Southeast Asia. So with that, Dwight, I'm delighted to invite you to begin your remarks.
Thank you, Richard. I've actually been very impressed with both of my previous two colleagues and their knowledge of East Asia and the relationship to Eastern Europe. I agree probably with 95% of what they say, and I note that both of them believe that reform has to be gradual and systematic. But I'm going to go back in history to the debates over how to reform the Soviet command system, particularly the debates that took place in the early 1990s, early mid-1990s, when the reforms in Eastern and Central Europe and the Soviet Union began. China's, of course, began much earlier in 1978, 79, and Vietnam's in 86 to 89 was more like Eastern Europe. You know, when I speak about the debates, I'm taking a rather parochial view of these debates. I'm talking about what American economists did, what World Bank economists talked about at that time. Mainly people in the West, including the people, Western economists who participated in various ways in the Eastern European reforms, and less so. I mean, there was some participation in the Chinese reforms from the West, but much less so. And in the early debates, this talk. The basic question was, should reform be rapid or should it be gradual? This was the rapid group, which was mostly the Western economists working on Eastern Europe, was that it had to be a big bang. It had to happen, everything had to happen at once. You had to free up prices, free up markets, and privatize everything. And privatize everything would somehow lead all of these former state enterprises to become efficient, more or less overnight. The alternative was China, which was, well, it's a slight overstatement to say that everything was gradual. The rural reforms were actually quite rapid over a period of 4 or 5 years. The basic argument was that China was going systematically, piece by piece, over through reform, and then the comparison was really just simply in terms of GDP. Who was winning the GDP fight? And the answer is, without question, in the 1990s, Eastern Europe was actually having negative growth. I agree with everything that was said about Eastern Europe once you're through that negative growth and what's happened since. And furthermore, I agree you had to probably have the negative growth to get the high growth later. That said, China was growing at an extremely rapid rate. Vietnam at later was also at a considerably more rapid rate. Although not as much. And so China, while you talk about threefold increases in Eastern and Central Europe, you're talking about a 25-fold increase in China in per capita income. The problem with that whole debate, and I participated in it, more or less on the side of gradualism, but the problem is it was comparing apples and oranges. There were fundamental differences between the East Asian, and when I'm talking about East Asia now, I'm only talking about China and Vietnam. I've written a book about my views of East Asia, from Southeast Asia up through Korea and China and so on. But that's just too complicated a topic to get into 15 minutes, in my view, although I think Professor Piatkowski did an excellent job in that regard. The problem, the key difference is, as I say, it's apples versus oranges, which tastes better. The key difference is Eastern Europe and even the Russian reforms, although less so, Eastern and Central Europe were even more political reforms than they were economic reforms. And as Professor Bokros said, you can't have the full economic reforms without the political reforms. And I'm going to talk about state enterprises in a moment that illustrates that point clearly in the Chinese and in the Vietnamese case. So in China, you had no political reform. There was a lot of liberalization in speech. For 30 years prior to Xi Jinping, you had a very lively intellectual life going up to and on the edge of politics, but going short of a full political discussion. But China, the Communist Party was never going to, never talked about any kind of political liberalization. And they didn't even, and they never explicitly said they were privatizing, even though there was a fair amount of privatization going on, particularly among smaller enterprises and the like. The second point, and I think it has something to do with some of the early comparisons of Professor Piatkowski, China and Vietnam were a lot poorer at the start than Eastern and Central Europe. They were, when they began reforms, their per capita incomes were more like, they were only slightly above Chad, Ethiopia, and so on, some of the poorest countries in Africa. they had more sophisticated economies, but in terms of per capita income, 70 to 80% of the population was in agriculture. And a big element of what got the success of the economic reforms going in both China and Vietnam was that they got rid of collectivization and went back to household agriculture. And that, plus some freeing up and raising of agricultural prices and some other things, that led to this tremendous boom for a time in agriculture and created the political support within the Communist Party for continued economic reform. The third difference was that, at least with China, the East European economies were all part of the Soviet trading bloc. And so initially in that 1990s, that whole bloc had to break up. And that undoubtedly was part of why things went badly. One of several reasons, no doubt. But I have two people who can correct me on whatever I say about Eastern and Central Europe. The ability to work in the broader international trading, the open economy integrated into the world economic system. China was already partially, and it had long since left the Comecon system. Vietnam was in it, and Vietnam initially had faced a really great problem on the balance of payments side, but they got lucky. The agricultural reforms led rapidly to major rice exports, whereas they had become a rice importer, very unlike Vietnam historically. The big rice, and then the oil developments done jointly with the Soviet Union came online just at the critical time in '89 and '90 when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia ended its supports of Vietnam. And in both cases, China and Vietnam had the enormous advantages of being integrated to some degree with Hong Kong and with the other East Asian who are masters at working with the market economies of the Western world. And so, the combination of, and here's where I differ a little bit with Professor Piatkowski, the reason China could grow that rapidly, the reason Vietnam has been growing at 7% a year, has a lot to do with the poverty. Early stages development, if you do everything right in purely economic terms now, you can have much higher rates of growth. You're not exactly copying, but you're easily adopting. You know what you have to do. You have a high investment rate. You get market reforms to increase efficiency. You're going to get high rates of growth. When you get up to $12, $14, $15, $20,000 per capita, you're going to grow more slowly. That's true of every single country in the world. And China is now in that stage of growing more slowly. Vietnam is not yet there. So there is this fundamental difference. And consistent, particularly with what I think Professor Bokros was talking about, if I turn now to the whole issue of state enterprises in China, and in the context of an economy that has not had any major political reform. China, as I say, the agricultural reforms were quite thorough in the 1979 to 1984 period. In 1984, China began to think about having reform of the industrial urban sector. And they passed a set of reforms which basically create a dual price system, a dual market, a free market for people who wanted to buy on a free market with higher prices, or people on a controlled market with low state set prices, which went basically to the state enterprises. leaving aside the problems of dual price systems, which create corruption opportunities and things of that sort. Basically, China in the 80s and through the 90s until the middle of the 1990s did actually very little to directly make the enterprises, the state enterprises, perform better. They thought that freeing up some prices like this might make them more efficient. It actually didn't. What it did was gradually, when you had a dual price system, eventually even the state enterprise all started producing for the market rather than for the centrally allocated goods. And so if anybody who wanted to get a good, including state enterprises, increasingly had to pay the market price. And by the early 90s, it was really a one price system, and it was no longer a two price system. What that also did was it revealed the extreme inefficiency of Chinese state enterprises. They were all, not all, but virtually a very high percentage of them were losing and losing lots of money. And this was also connected to the enormous non-performing loans of the banking system, which were officially 25% of the assets of the loans of the banking system, and most people think it was more like 40%. I slightly disagree with the view that there's anything like this going on in the banks today. The non-performing loans are much, much smaller. However, so what you had in the 80s and not up through the mid 90s is you had a rapid development. Freeing up the markets for industrial inputs led to something called the township and village enterprise boom, enormous boom, carried industry for 12, 15 years. It was not liked by some of the party conservatives, but it was what really made for the very high rate of GDP growth in China at that time. But what the rest of the reforms are doing was revealing how bad the state enterprises were. Furthermore, not only were they losing money, they were borrowing, continuing pouring money into the system, investing heavily, and they were major sources of inflation. And so you basically, it's not until the mid to late 1990s, you appoint Zhu Rongji who was then deputy prime minister, as head of the central bank, and then later he becomes prime minister. He basically pushes joining the WTO to force the enterprises to become competitive, including the state enterprises. But to get rid of the inflation, initially just uses administrative controls, but he also forces the state enterprises to let 40 to 50 million people go. That is, theoretically they were retired or they got other jobs, but it was basically a massive firing of the state enterprise workers that did make the state enterprises moderately profitable. That said, they also had subsidies. They had advantages, particularly in the markets. In certain markets, they had monopolies and so on. So the subsidies, and despite all that effort on Zhu Rongji's part, the enterprises, every study of the Chinese enterprises, and the same is true of the Vietnamese enterprises, state enterprises, shows that they are substantially less productive than the private enterprises. And the high growth was carried mostly by the private enterprises, and in the earlier years, agriculture and the township and village enterprises. Now that's the situation as you come up to the mid 2000s, and Xi Jinping and initially the government looks like it's going to make a major effort to complete the move toward a market economy, again, without any fundamental political change. There's even talk of much more moving toward rule of law, but it's very hard to have rule of law when you have a Communist Party that can overrule any law. But in fact, what happens is Xi Jinping turns, and this is consistent with one of Professor Bokros's remarks. Essentially, you can go backwards, and that's what China is doing today. China has marched, the state enterprises that had been sort of gradually losing share of the market are now being made the center of the development strategy of Xi Jinping. Furthermore, the private enterprises have increasing political involvement. The party committees and the party personnel of the private enterprises the party committees have a much bigger role in the private enterprises. There's much more regulatory control, and in China, which has way too much regulatory control, and it's discretionary regulatory control. So China has been moving significantly backwards in a way that is probably making it, the maintenance of a high growth rate considerably more difficult. So, and I think I'll basically end there. I think the lesson that is consistent with the remarks of my two previous panelists is that if you don't have thorough political reform, and you still have a very large state sector, the Communist Party clearly has advantages holding on to a large state sector. It's a major economic base of the system, of the party system, and with the certain kinds of leadership, you're going to go backwards rather than forwards. Under Deng Xiaoping, they went forward on the economic reforms, but not on political. Under Xi Jinping, they're going backwards. They're not going back to the command economy. There's going to, the market forces are still the dominant forces and will continue. There will still be an open economy. There will still be a major trading economy, at least as long as the rest of the world is willing to have them be part of that economy. So essentially, whether you can learn this from the East European, I mean, the East European economy, the state enterprises had to move, most of them, well, when you joined the European Union, you had to obey all kinds of rules of the European Union. No such thing happened in China. No such thing is happening in Vietnam, where I've also done lots of work. Vietnam is a little politically a bit more liberal, but it's still basically run by the Communist Party. And it could go back, it's gone backward a little bit itself with a more conservative top leadership. So whether there are lessons from Eastern Europe, the lesson is simply that you can't have completely satisfactory economic reform without political reform. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Dwight, for the excellent and deeply insightful remarks. We have many important questions and topics to discuss. I invite anyone in the Zoom audience to submit questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. But in the meantime, I'd like to begin the discussion by bringing up an issue with perhaps immediate contemporary relevance for China. In recent months, the visibility of banking issues in China and financial sector issues in China has been growing. There have been a number of protests around mostly small banks in Henan and Anhui provinces in the last few months. And this might bring us back to the experiences of banking sector and financial sector problems in Eastern and Central European countries in the 1980s and 1990s. So I'd like to ask all the panelists, how did Eastern European countries or countries leaving communist systems effectively or unsuccessfully try to reform their banking systems and tackle the issue of non-performing loans? What kinds of strategies seemed to work or did not work in retrospect? And then by extension, what can countries in East Asia potentially learn from how their European predecessors approached reforming the financial sectors? Now, a very large and weighty topic, but to the extent that one can speculate on the possible lessons. We'd love to hear all of your remarks.
Something about the nature of the housing thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Just so that it's clear we're all on the same page. The big real estate developers have primarily relied on advanced sales to capitalize, to get the capital needed to produce the apartments that they were selling. So they sell them in advance and they get the money. It was a common East Asian thing. Because they were so heavily leveraged, in addition to that, to keep going, that many of them were going bankrupt, that many of the real estate developers were going bankrupt. And then there's been a reaction among the people who, I mean, the population gets its primary capital for investing in housing from either from their savings or from mortgages that they get from the banks. And so in Hunan, there is an example of, and it's not just in Hunan, of mortgagees saying they're not going to pay their mortgages and therefore threatening the bank's stability because it's a big part of the bank portfolio. So, you know, the problem doesn't start with the banks. It starts with the way in which the whole private housing sector has been financed. Anyway, but Eastern Europe, what do you learn?
See, Lajos, would you like to?
Yes, I also want to say a word. You have to, Professor.
I'm not sure to what extent the initial conditions in Central and Eastern Europe can be compared to what we see today in China. In Central and Eastern Europe, it was not only the housing sector, real estate development, and over-leveraging of buyers and developers was the problem at that time, but the whole economy was bankrupt. It is important to realize that when the two-tier banking system was established, which was new in all these countries except for Yugoslavia, where at least formally there was a two-tier banking system. The newly established commercial banks, most of them had been carved out of the mainframe of the former central bank. And these newly established commercial banks inherited immediately on day one an extraordinarily large amount of bad loans. So at the moment of their establishment, they were insolvent, technically bankrupt. As a consequence, there was little choice for the new democratic governments but to bail out many of these banks, although some of them were closed down immediately And the bailout meant a huge amount of recapitalization. Huge amount of recapitalization, which happened in two different ways. One was open recapitalization by the state, and another one was an asset swap. So the bad loans were carved out of the assets of the commercial banks and taken over by the Ministry of Finance. And the Ministry of Finance basically paid by offering, formally at least, good assets, which were long-term government bonds. And then, if this recapitalization was successful, then the banks started to lend, and supposedly they were expected to lend only to profitable enterprises so that they could avoid reaccumulating bad loans, which was not always the case. And in some countries, certain state-owned banks were recapitalized several times, 3 times, 4 times, even 5 times. Now in China, I was there when this financial sector reform was discussed under Zhu Rongji and some of the others. And they decided to put the bad loans into asset management companies, which were separated from the banks. But they decided not to privatize the banks, the state-owned banks, and they did not require the banks to strengthen their risk management procedures. As a consequence, there was no any obstacle to accumulate once again bad loans. And then another recapitalization took place. And this is unfortunately happening every 5th year, even today. And most of the state banks are bailed out by either fiscal funds or preferential loans from the People's Bank of China. I understand that the problem is much more acute in the area of housing finance and real estate development and mortgage lending. But so long as the most important clients are the re-strengthened state-owned enterprises, which are not required to work under the same efficiency requirements or rules than private sector enterprises, there is no way to avoid the reappearance of non-performing loans time and again. The banking system is an interesting focal point which would concentrate all the problems of the economy because it is related to all sectors. And when there are large sectors which remain inefficient for political reasons or whatever reasons, that in the second round will immediately reflect on the balance sheet of the banks, and then the government faces a problem of how to recapitalize the banks. So the only way to cut this umbilical cord is to go for real privatization, which from my perspective means strong strategic investors and improved corporate governance.
I have a few points to make very quickly. And let me start by saying that unlike, say, China and a few other countries in the region, real estate has never been an engine of growth in Central and Eastern Europe. So I think this is a fundamental difference. If you believe some of the estimates, real estate investment has been responsible for up to 1/4 of growth in China. That's totally incomparable to what it is in CEE. Their real estate investment was virtually insignificant. and the mortgage markets have not developed. I mean, the region has started with 0 mortgages in '89. The concept was hardly known. And the mortgage debt has grown over the past 33 years, but still remains relatively low at about 20% of GDP, at least in Poland. So it's very different from what it is in China. But I think the transition has also sort of 4 lessons for East Asia. One, and I'll base it on the example of Poland, but I think, again, it can be a good practice for others. One, the banks in Poland, the state-owned banks, were commercialized even under communism before '89, and that largely stopped directed lending. So while the Communist Party was still making phone calls to the banks to give money to a corporate A or corporate B, commercialized banks have much less of an incentive to actually follow the instruction. Second, and I think this is a huge difference, a lot of the transition in Central and Eastern Europe in the banking sector happened with the help of foreign banks, the banks that have brought in the critical know-how of how to lend money, how to be profit-oriented, how to assess the risk of lending, how to pretty much create a modern banking systems. Some countries in the region, like the Baltic states, they virtually have sold off all the banks to foreign capital, and it's 100% foreign owned, even almost 100% foreign owned even today. Some other countries like Poland have been pretty cautious. It started by selling off up to 10% of equity in state-owned banks to foreign banks. And it was, I think, a great idea because it allowed for these state-owned banks to gradually receive the know-how from the foreign banks, and only later they actually got bought very often by the same partners. But I think this gradual approach where you sell some part of equity and create partnerships with foreign banks that have all the knowledge in the banking sector, I think it will be useful lessons learned for the region. And third, strong and independent supervision, which a lot of in most countries in the region have been part of a newly independent central bank. So supervision was critical, and independent supervision was critical to ensure that the banks really follow the basic rules of banking. This is not the case in many countries in the region, where again, supervision is just a part of the political system. And fourth and final lesson is on APLs. All countries in Central and Eastern Europe started from a large NPL burden. Unlike in East Asia, these were not mortgage loans. These were all corporate loans to state-owned enterprises that could not service them. And countries in the region have dealt with them in various ways. I'm familiar with the Polish sort of NPL reform, which I think worked out really well. So in 1993, Poland introduced a loan for equity plan, whereby the banks were allowed through various regulatory sticks and carrots to change the loans and NPLs that were associated with it into equity of enterprises based on the business plans of those enterprises. The final result of this loan to equity restructuring has been that virtually most of the NPLs got cleaned out. And after 94 and 95, the system has sort of never looked back, and there was not a single banking crisis since then. So again, four key lessons there. Again, commercialized banking with no direct lending. That's probably not going to happen in some countries in Asia. Foreign participation, strong and independent supervision, and an early action on NPLs. Thanks.
Thank you. We will now try to address some of the excellent and growing number of audience questions. I'd like to begin with a question from Professor Bert Hoffman, Director of the East Asian Institute, which is focused primarily on China. Dwight Perkins, in his remarks, mentioned that the slowdown of China is natural, although some, such as Justin Lin at Peking University, would say that China could still grow with 7 to 8% growth rates per year for 2 decades. Others, such as Michael Pettis, in contrast, believe that due to the lack of reforms, a growth rate of around 3% per year is a more likely level of growth for the coming decade. Where do you come out on this issue and why?
I have disagreed with Justin Lin for more than the past decade. I think his view of which is based on looking at the productivity of Chinese workers versus Western workers, and the gap in overall productivity, and how that could be closed, and could be closed over 2 or 3 decades at a continued 8 or 9% rate of growth. The problem with that is that, you know, it's, as I indicated earlier, it's much easier to, if you get the economics of it basically right, you can, and you're at a very early stage of development, whether you're talking about Korea or Taiwan. I mean, the growth rates for Korea and Singapore, which Professor Piatkowski put up, were for fairly recent times when their per capita income was high. When you're way behind, you can, to some degree, look at the people ahead of you, and you can go very, very rapidly, simply by doing more of the same sort of thing, or doing what you know you have to do in the next stage. Once it's not entirely clear all the things that happen. Barry Eichengreen and I did a book on Korea with another economist to show why Korea was never going to grow its 7. Our friends in Korea who we were working with said, oh, Korea's got to go back to 7 or 8% growth. There was no way Korea was going back to 7 or 8% growth once it reached what today would be about $18,000, $20,000 per capita. You know, you've run out of surplus labor in the countryside, but a lot of it is simply you have to do a lot more innovation on your own, and when you do innovation on your own, you make mistakes. You're moving more and more toward the service sector, away from manufacturing. Building more textile factories is a fairly straightforward fact, but once you've saturated that market, you've got to go on to do more complicated things, and so on and so forth. And we looked at all the countries in the world that had gotten up to beyond $20,000 per capita. They all slow down. Now, then the question becomes, what is the actual rate of growth that China can sustain? I think China for the last decade or so has been actually artificially sustaining a higher growth rate than it really has the ability to do. They have an enormous investment rate. It's an investment rate where the total factor productivity has been going steadily down, is now getting down towards 0 by at least some measures. And so the rate of return, which is another version of that, is falling very, very sharply on the investment, and leaving aside the impacts of COVID, it's going to be very difficult, I think, to sustain 5-6% growth over the next decade, which is not to say it's impossible. You can build more and more infrastructure, and depending on how you measure the value of that infrastructure, you measure the value often by the inputs. But when you're building a big highway across Xinjiang, the actual rate of return on investment is very low. It probably shouldn't be valued at the value of the inputs. And so on. And the same with the railroads. I mean, they have a magnificent transport system. The housing problem, which was a big part of the early story, people lived in about family of 3 lived in a 25 square meter apartment. They now live in 100 square meter apartments on average. that housing boom was great, but now that housing boom is over. And so they're all struggling. The infrastructure is an artificial way to keep, so they can artificially make it look like they're growing at 5%, but I don't think they can probably sustain that in a real sense. I'm sorry, that's a little too long.
Thank you. Marcin or Lajos, would you like to?
Yes, I have a few comments here on particularly on China. I think China will become high income as defined by the World Bank, because it's a pretty low threshold in terms of the income that you need to be classified high income. But then it will still mean that GDP per capita in China, PPP, relative to, for instance, the United States, will be about 1/3 of what it is in America, which means that China would have to grow at a fast rates for decades to come to really close this gap. And I think indeed the many reasons to believe that this growth over the next 40 years will be totally different than the growth over the past 40 years. And we heard some of the reasons from Professor Perkins. I think it's clear that there's a decline in potential growth in China. It's because of the diminishing rates of return on investment. As I said earlier, China overinvests in public investment. Central and Eastern Europe underinvests. So both should meet in the middle, but I'm not clear that this will happen in China, because public investment is the residual in China. Whenever growth is not high enough, public investment is jacked up to make up for the difference. But because of diminishing returns, the 11th highway from Beijing to Shanghai will not have the same returns as the first highway connecting the two cities. So there will clearly be an issue. I think China also has a challenge of an endemically low level of consumption. And it's not clear whether this is changing or this will be changing. And it's a complicated debate of what changes it would require in terms of particularly the role of the local governments. There are constraints on the growth of the private sector. I think that's what the last 2 years have shown. And we'll have to see what will be the consequences. And there's obviously, last point, geopolitics. I think there will be one entirely different than what it was during the past 40 years, where China was welcomed to join the global markets. Now it's, for better or worse, it's the other way around, which would mean that it would be much harder for China to absorb technologies from the West. And it will also be much harder for China to export its own technologies, particularly to the West, giving the sort of lack of trust that seems to exist. So overall, I think while China, I'm convinced, will become high income, among 46 countries that will be high income, including China, in a few years from now, 45 of them will be liberal democracies with open markets, and China will be an exception. So the question is, what does it all say? It seems that all the 45 countries suggest that being an open society, both politically and economy, is critical to growth. Maybe China will surprise us and will be an exception to the rule, but it will be a big exception. I mean, 1 out of 46 countries. Thanks.
Thank you. We have many questions, and we'll try to get through as many as we can, although I may need to ask for brief responses for some of them. Ignacio Polo at Nanyang Technological University here in Singapore asks for Professor Bokros, could you expand on the current situation for Hungary, including in its relations with the People's Republic of China, such as your points in the penultimate slide of your PowerPoint? And perhaps by extension, are there lessons that Eastern Europe, or Eastern and Central Europe, can learn from the development experience of East Asia? I think you're muted.
Yes. First, yeah, maybe I can go back to my slides if possible. Let me see if I can share them again. And probably it's better to manage it this way. Yeah, I very much appreciate that question, and it's an irony of history that Hungary is now going also backwards, pretty much the same way as Professor Perkins indicated that under Xi Jinping, China is going back on certain reforms. So the points are the following here. In 2010, a new government came to power, which can be characterized as a fiercely nationalist, populist, etatist government. It has nationalized several large banks. So what Professor Piatkowski mentioned, that most Central and Eastern European countries had privatized the large banks and some of the small ones as well, initially to foreign strategic investors. Now, this reform was reversed, and the Hungarian Prime Minister clearly stated that his goal was to regain at least Hungarian ownership over at least 50% of the assets of the whole banking sector. So they nationalized several banks, which in itself may not be such a big issue, but the big issue is that through the newly nationalized banks, they also practice the same type of directed lending as it is practiced by China through the 5 larger state-owned banks. The newly nationalized Hungarian banks finance the pet projects of the government, and they offer preferential credits to friends, buddies, and all those oligarchs who now own a bigger and bigger slice of the cake in Hungary, not only in the banking sector, but also in public utilities and in many other areas. So going back on reforms meant first and foremost nationalization, which is clearly a reversal of what we can call privatization. From my perspective, very negative tendency. The second important point here is that the government in Hungary is not only nationalizing certain enterprises which they themselves call strategic, whatever it means, but they also fixed certain prices at an artificially low level. Most important in Hungary is the public utility prices. The Hungarian fiscal sector spends more than 5% of GDP on subsidizing retail public utility prices today. It is more than the whole amount of EU funds received by Hungary every year, which shows you how a country can waste completely EU funds. So EU funds may or may not help, depending on how the government in power utilizes them. And I'm sorry to say that the EU is no guarantee for efficient spending at all. The EU has been ignoring this complete waste of subsidies and funds from itself in Hungary, and could not change the rule of the game at all. Third point, which is again a striking similarity with China, the Hungarian government implemented a whole host of new specific, sector-specific taxes on certain areas like public utilities, banks, financial sector institutions, retail, trade, and many other areas, advertisement, for example, newspapers, etc., which led to a situation whereby, as I mentioned, it is not the market success, but the privileges coming from the government which selects the winners. It's no longer the market. It's very, very strange because Hungary is an extremely small country. If you compare it to China, even if you compare it to Poland, it's much smaller. And one would ask the question, how on earth a small open economy can survive when you have such a heavy-handed interventionist government? And the answer to that question is that the government deliberately left one sector out of its heavy-handed regulation, which is the export sector, the manufacturing export sector, the tradables, which are almost completely dominated by German, Austrian, Italian, and French companies. And they export a lot. They are very efficient. And they are supported by extremely low taxation, 9% corporate income tax in Hungary. And you may have noticed that the Hungarian government is the staunch opponent of the 15% minimum corporate tax, which is now to be applied even in the United States. So you have a dualist economy, one sector completely dominated by foreigners, that is the export sector, very low tax, low bureaucracy, low red tape. And another sector, which is basically the non-tradable domestic sector, which has high taxes, at the same time high subsidies, huge losses, inefficient, absolutely inefficient, absorbing a growing part of fiscal outlays. So Hungary has, as I put it here, slipped back to what we can call managed capitalism, where the state is there to distort competition and select winners and losers. And there are many more important points, which I will skip for lack of time. Thank you.
I have just one comment, and I apologize, I'll have to go in 13 minutes. But there was the end of the question asked about what is it that Central and Eastern Europe can learn from East Asia, which I think is a very good question. I think my bottom line is that I think East Asia can learn more from Central and Eastern Europe than vice versa. But there are at least 3 lessons that because CE has done so well in terms of economic development and well-being. But at the same time, I think there are 3 lessons that CE can learn from East Asia. One, increasing public investment. I say it for the 3rd time, but I think it's critical. CE underinvests, spends about 4% of GDP on public investment. Countries in East Asia, including Korea, when was growing at a fast rate, was investing much more than 4%, 8 to even 10%. And I would want CE to double the investment rate to close to 10% and spend the money on greening and digitalization of their economies. The second point is a focus on R&D and innovation. Clearly, China and Korea are example of countries that have invested huge amounts in changing the structure of the economies. And I think this is something that CE can also learn from. It also underinvests in R&D. Perhaps 5% of GDP spent on R&D, as in Korea, is too much. And I think there are strongly declining diminishing returns there. But now the region spends much less than 2% of GDP on R&D. So clearly there's much space to improve. And finally, strengthening incentives for local governments to grow. You know, having worked on China for 5 years, I'm surprised at how little attention is paid in CEE to how to measure the economic performance of regions. I think most Hungarians or Poles or Czechs would not be able to say what is the GDP growth rate of the regions in their country. And I think this is unfortunate. And if I were, say, a minister of finance in Poland, I would introduce sort of stick and carrots, or $1 billion award for the fastest growing region in the country, so that the local policymakers, which have substantial autonomy in terms of the decisions they take, would actually have strong incentives to be better than the others. Thanks.
Thank you. Given that it's getting late, we have many questions still outstanding, I'd like to combine two questions together for a final round of points before we conclude. The first is that from Michael Capron at the University of Belgrade, who asks effectively, the main drivers of economic growth in the 1990s seem very different from the main drivers today. AI, big data, as opposed to perhaps banks or industries in the 1990s. So should we avoid referring to the previous century altogether when talking about the present and future models of development? And then we have a question from Frank Piquet, a professor and a visiting scholar in Singapore, who would like to ask whether we should consider China a transition economy in the first place. There have been many comparisons with Central and Eastern Europe, but at the same time, there's a fundamentally different political situation with respect to China. China perhaps does not want to develop into a capitalist economy that the West believes is the right outcome of reform. China's choices point in the direction of wishing to become a great power under the leadership of the CCP, and economic growth is no longer quite the first priority. So perhaps China's self-consciously moving away from transition. So the first question is the value of comparisons with 20th century models of economic development. And the second question refers to what extent should we think about China as a transition economy that merits good comparisons or strong comparisons with.
Richard, if you allow me to go first.
Yes, absolutely.
Apologies to other speakers. Quick two bottom lines on these two excellent questions. One, I think AI, digitalization, and all of it is more hype than reality, and therefore the old economic models and thinking still applies. We talk a lot about the new technologies, but they have not translated into higher productivity growth anywhere. In fact, as I showed in one of my slides, the world is facing a declining productivity growth. So I think you can, again, to paraphrase Solo, you can see AI, digitalization, and whatever have you everywhere, except in productivity statistics. And I think this hype, this will, I think, continue. One can only hope that these technologies will indeed start translating into productivity, inshallah, but it has not happened yet, and I am skeptical it will happen anytime soon. On the second question of transition, indeed, China is fundamentally different than Central and Eastern Europe because of different objectives of transition. Central and Eastern Europe transition to be open and democratic and economically successful. That's somewhat different than in China. And without elaborating too much on this point, recently the great journal, China, an international journal that is at the National University of Singapore, I published a review of Isabella Weber's book on China's shock therapy, when I make the argument that it's very difficult to compare CEE and China, and there's relatively little that we can learn from this transition experience. Thank you.
Thank you. And perhaps we can conclude if Dwight or Lajos would like to give brief 30-second responses.
Shall I, or Professor
Please.
Perkins go first?
Lajos, maybe you
Okay.
can start.
You go ahead, yeah.
I agree with Marcin on the first point. Just I would like to add that I'm not a great fan of industrial policy, so I will never identify certain sectors as the engine of growth. I would rather restrict myself to identifying those basic institutions which are necessary for the market participants to decide where to invest their money. As a consequence, economic growth can come as a natural result of their own activity rather than the result of state regulation and direction. When it comes to transition, I think China is a transition economy, at least in the sense of having transformed its economy from a command system to a much more market-orientated one. Within that, the most important point being the emergence of a very large private sector. Of course, it's an unfinished agenda because state-owned enterprises keep playing a fundamental and important role in economic development, and I don't think that this etatist model is good for the further high-level growth. At the same time, the transition in China is unfinished, at least if we use the definition of transition applicable to Central and Eastern Europe, that without political reforms, without those strong institutions which guarantee the rule of the law, you will never finish and you will never arrive at a well-functioning market economy. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just add, very brief. China may not want and doesn't want capitalism, but it does want to be a world power. And for that, it needs a very strong economy. The infrastructure investments were very useful for a period of 20 years. They're no longer terribly useful for maintaining growth. The real question, and it's an open one, which I don't have the answer to, is whether they can do enough domestic R&D and become a leader in technology without actually being fully integrated into the modern high-income world.
Thank you. And with that, I'm pleased to conclude an excellent discussion on economic development in both Eastern Europe and East Asia. I'd like to thank our wonderful Zoom audience from all over the world for sticking with us with the presentations and the question and answers. And I'd like to especially thank our three excellent panelists for their deeply insightful and very, very informative remarks on history and future potential prospects for economic development in these two important regions. with that, I hope everyone in US and European time zones will have a wonderful rest of their day and next few hours to ponder these topics. And I'd like to wish a very good evening for everyone here in Singapore and East Asia. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.